Lieutenant Marcus Chen strutted through the bustling corridors of Naval Base Charleston with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed him recognition. His freshly pressed uniform bore the gleaming bars of his recent promotion, and he wore them like a badge of superiority. At 28, Marcus had climbed the ranks faster than most of his peers, though not necessarily through merit alone. His father's connections in the Pentagon had certainly smoothed his path, a fact that Marcus conveniently overlooked when boasting about his achievements. The base cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime chatter as Marcus grabbed his tray and surveyed the room. Officers of various ranks occupied tables throughout the space, their conversations mixing reports of recent exercises with casual banter about weekend plans. Marcus spotted an empty table near the center of the room, perfect for his daily ritual of holding court with junior officers who hung on his every word about military strategy and career advancement. As he made his way toward the table, Marcus noticed a woman sitting alone in the corner. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with short auburn hair and an understated presence that seemed almost invisible among the more boisterous groups around her. Her uniform was clean but unremarkable, and Marcus couldn't immediately identify her rank from across the room. What caught his attention, however, was the small insignia on her collar that he didn't recognize. Marcus changed course and approached her table, his curiosity piqued by what he assumed was some sort of honorary pin or perhaps a mistake in her uniform regulations. He had always prided himself on knowing every detail of military protocol, and pointing out errors in others gave him a particular satisfaction. The woman looked up as Marcus approached, her green eyes meeting his with a calm, measured gaze. She had been quietly eating her lunch while reading what appeared to be a technical manual, completely absorbed in her work until his shadow fell across her table. "Excuse me," Marcus said with a slight smirk, his voice carrying just enough authority to draw the attention of nearby tables. "I couldn't help but notice your collar insignia. I'm not familiar with that particular pin. Is it some kind of commemorative piece? Or perhaps something from a previous assignment?" The woman set down her fork and looked at Marcus with an expression that was neither hostile nor particularly welcoming. She seemed to be assessing him, taking in his posture, his tone, and the obvious expectation in his voice that she would explain herself to his satisfaction. "It's just a standard service insignia," she replied simply, her voice steady and unrevealing. Marcus leaned closer, squinting at the small metal pin. It featured an intricate design that he genuinely didn't recognize, which frustrated him more than he cared to admit. His knowledge of military insignia was usually comprehensive, and this gap in his understanding felt like a personal failing. "Standard service insignia?" Marcus chuckled, the sound carrying a note of condescension that made several nearby officers glance in their direction. "Ma'am, I've been in the service for 8 years, and I can identify every regulation pin, medal, and insignia in the Navy. That's definitely not standard issue." The woman's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in her eyes that Marcus was too focused on his own superiority to notice. She took a sip of her coffee before responding. "Perhaps you haven't encountered this particular insignia in your assignments," she said diplomatically. This response only fueled Marcus's conviction that he was dealing with someone who either didn't understand proper uniform regulations or was trying to pass off some unauthorized decoration as official military insignia. His voice grew louder, ensuring that his words would carry to the surrounding tables. "Look, I don't want to make this into a bigger deal than it needs to be, but wearing unauthorized insignia is a serious violation of uniform regulations. As an officer, I have a responsibility to maintain standards." Marcus straightened his shoulders, clearly enjoying his role as the enforcer of military protocol. If that's some kind of civilian award or personal memento, it doesn't belong on a military uniform. The cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter as more people became aware of the conversation taking place. Some officers stopped eating to listen, while others exchanged glances that suggested they recognized something Marcus did not. The woman remained seated, her composure unshaken by Marcus's increasingly aggressive tone. She folded her hands on the table and looked up at him with what could only be described as patience wearing thin. "I appreciate your concern for uniform regulations," she said, her voice maintaining its calm tone despite the growing tension. "However, I can assure you that my insignia is entirely appropriate for my position." Marcus let out a short laugh that echoed through the now quiet cafeteria. "Your position? What position could possibly authorize insignia that I've never seen before? Are you claiming some sort of special assignment or clearance level that somehow puts you above standard regulations?" The woman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Around them, the silence had become complete, with every conversation in the cafeteria grinding to a halt. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their usual clatter of dishes and preparation, sensing the drama unfolding in their dining area. "Lieutenant," the woman said, her use of his rank deliberate and pointed, "I think you may be overstepping your authority here." Marcus's face flushed red at what he perceived as insubordination. The fact that she had correctly identified his rank while he remained ignorant of hers only added to his frustration. In his mind, this proved that she was somehow trying to embarrass him in front of his colleagues. "Overstepping my authority?" Marcus's voice rose to a level that would have been inappropriate in any military setting. "Ma'am, I don't know what civilian organization you think you represent, but this is a United States Navy facility, and uniform regulations apply to everyone who wears this uniform." The woman slowly closed her technical manual and placed it on the table beside her tray. When she looked up at Marcus again, something fundamental had shifted in her demeanor. The patience was still there, but it was now accompanied by something that made several veteran officers in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Lieutenant Chen," she said, and Marcus startled at hearing his name spoken by someone he had never met. "I think we need to clarify a few things about uniform regulations and chain of command." Marcus's confidence wavered for the first time since the conversation began. How did she know his name? He glanced around the cafeteria, suddenly aware of how many people were watching this exchange, and noticed expressions on several faces that suggested they knew something he didn't. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" Marcus asked, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. The woman stood up slowly, and as she rose to her full height, Marcus found himself looking up at someone whose presence seemed to fill the space around her. She wasn't particularly tall, but something about her bearing commanded attention in a way that had nothing to do with physical stature. "Not directly," she replied, "but I know quite a bit about you, Lieutenant. Your recent performance evaluations, your assignment history, even your father's position at the Pentagon." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. How could this woman, whoever she was, have access to his personnel files? Only officers with significant clearance and authority could access that kind of information, and something in her tone suggested that she not only had access, but had actually taken the time to review his records. "I don't understand," Marcus stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The woman reached into her pocket and withdrew a small leather case. She opened it carefully and placed it on the table where Marcus could see it clearly. Inside was an identification card that made his knees weak and his mouth go dry. The insignia he had been mocking, the pin he had dismissed as unauthorized decoration, was clearly visible on the ID card, alongside a photograph and a title that made Marcus's military career flash before his eyes in a moment of pure terror. Number, The Revelation. Admiral Sarah Mitchell watched as Lieutenant Chen's face transformed from confusion to recognition to absolute horror. The identification card lay open on the table between them, displaying her photograph alongside the title that commanded respect throughout the entire Pacific Fleet. Fleet Commander, United States Navy. The cafeteria had become a tomb of silence. Every person in the room understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing. A junior lieutenant had just spent 10 minutes publicly humiliating one of the most powerful officers in the Navy, questioning her uniform regulations, and suggesting she was wearing unauthorized insignia. Marcus stared at the identification card as if it might change if he looked long enough. The insignia he had mocked was the fleet commander's pin, a symbol of authority that represented command over hundreds of ships and thousands of personnel. His mouth moved soundlessly as he tried to process the catastrophe that his arrogance had created. Admiral Mitchell closed the identification case and returned it to her pocket with deliberate calm. Her movements were precise and controlled. The kind of composure that comes from years of making decisions that affect thousands of lives and millions of dollars in naval assets. "Lieutenant Chen," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in briefing rooms from Washington to Tokyo. "Perhaps now would be an appropriate time for you to reconsider your understanding of naval insignia and chain of command." Marcus tried to speak, but his voice cracked on the first syllable. He cleared his throat and attempted again, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to maintain some semblance of military bearing. "Admiral Mitchell, I had no idea. I sincerely apologize for." Marcus stumbled over his words, each attempt at an apology sounding more inadequate than the last. The Admiral raised her hand slightly, a gesture that immediately silenced Marcus and drew the attention of everyone in the room. In that moment, her authority was absolute and undeniable. She had spent 30 years earning the right to wear that insignia, starting as an ensign fresh out of the Naval Academy and working her way through every level of command. "Lieutenant," Admiral Mitchell said, her tone suggesting that she was choosing her words very carefully. "Your apology, while noted, doesn't address the fundamental issues that this incident has revealed." She gestured toward an empty chair across from her table, a clear indication that this conversation was far from over. Marcus approached the chair with the reluctance of someone walking toward their own court-martial. As he sat down, he could feel the eyes of every person in the cafeteria tracking his movement. Admiral Mitchell resumed her seat and leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a level that required Marcus to strain to hear her words. This forced him to focus completely on what she was saying, eliminating any possibility of distraction or misunderstanding. "In the past 10 minutes, Lieutenant, you have demonstrated several concerning behaviors that reflect poorly not only on yourself, but on the entire officer corps." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "You approached a fellow service member with the assumption that you possessed superior knowledge. You questioned their right to wear their insignia without first identifying yourself or establishing any authority to do so. Most importantly, you escalated a situation in a public forum without gathering basic information about the person you were addressing." Marcus nodded frantically, desperate to show that he understood the severity of his mistakes. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead, despite the air conditioning in the cafeteria. "Yes, ma'am, I understand completely. I was completely out of line, and I take full responsibility for my actions." Admiral Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested that she was evaluating more than just his immediate response to being discovered. "Do you understand, Lieutenant? Because your behavior suggests a pattern of assumptions and decision-making that concerns me greatly." She opened her technical manual to a page marked with several tabs and annotations. This manual contains updated fleet protocols that directly affect operations in your current assignment. When I arrived here today for my inspection of this facility, I was reviewing these protocols to ensure that all personnel under my command are operating with the most current information. The word inspection hit Marcus like a physical blow. Admiral Mitchell wasn't just passing through the base or making a casual visit. She was conducting an official inspection of the facility, which meant that everything he had said and done was now part of an official record. "Your assumption that an unfamiliar insignia must be unauthorized demonstrates a troubling lack of intellectual curiosity and professional humility," Admiral Mitchell continued. "In the modern Navy, officers encounter new technologies, new protocols, and new organizational structures on a regular basis. The ability to adapt, learn, and ask appropriate questions is essential for effective leadership." Marcus wanted to disappear into the floor. Every word Admiral Mitchell spoke was a professional death sentence, delivered with the precision of someone who had ended careers with less provocation than what he had just provided. "Furthermore," the Admiral said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she was building toward a conclusion, "your immediate assumption that you possess the authority to confront and correct a fellow service member, without first establishing the facts, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of military protocol and chain of Century 46 command." She closed the manual and fixed Marcus with a stare that made him feel as though she could see directly into his soul. Around them, the cafeteria remained absolutely silent, with even the kitchen staff frozen in place as they witnessed this unprecedented dressing down of a junior officer by a fleet commander. Tell me, Lieutenant Chen, what do you think would happen if one of your subordinates approached you in this manner? What if a petty officer decided that your insignia looked unfamiliar and publicly questioned your right to wear it? Marcus swallowed hard before responding. I would consider it insubordination, ma'am. It would result in immediate disciplinary action. Admiral Mitchell nodded slowly. Yet you felt comfortable doing exactly that to someone you had never met, without any knowledge of their background, experience, or authority level. The implications of her words hung in the air like smoke from a controlled detonation. Marcus realized that he had not only embarrassed himself, but had also demonstrated exactly the kind of poor judgment and arrogance that ended military careers. Lieutenant Chen, Admiral Mitchell said, her voice returning to its earlier calm tone. I want you to take a moment to consider what this incident reveals about your approach to leadership, your respect for fellow service members, and your understanding of the principles that govern our military structure. Marcus sat in stunned silence, his mind racing through the implications of what had just occurred. In less than 15 minutes, he had gone from feeling confident and superior to facing potential career-ending consequences for his arrogance and poor judgment. Admiral Mitchell stood up from her chair, and the entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath as she prepared to deliver what everyone understood would be the conclusion of this extraordinary encounter. The reckoning. Admiral Mitchell remained standing for a long moment, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the cafeteria. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, with Marcus Chen frozen in his chair, waiting for the professional execution that seemed inevitable. When the Admiral finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 decades of naval service and the authority of someone who had earned her position through merit, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to the principles of military leadership. Lieutenant Chen, stand up. Marcus scrambled to his feet so quickly that he nearly knocked over his chair. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, and he struggled to maintain proper military posture, while his entire body trembled with the realization of what he had done. In 30 years of service, Admiral Mitchell began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria, I have encountered many officers who struggled with the transition from following orders to giving them. The jump from enlisted ranks to officer status, or from junior officer to senior leadership, requires a fundamental shift in perspective that not everyone masters successfully. Marcus listened with the desperate attention of someone whose career hung in the balance. Every word the Admiral spoke could determine whether he would continue serving in the Navy or find himself looking for civilian employment by the end of the week. However, Admiral Mitchell continued, I have rarely encountered such a clear demonstration of the attitudes and behaviors that make an officer unsuitable for leadership responsibility. The words hit Marcus like individual bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. Around the cafeteria, other officers watched with a mixture of fascination and horror, witnessing a masterclass in military discipline being delivered by one of the Navy's most respected leaders. Your actions today demonstrate several critical failures in judgment and character, Admiral Mitchell said, her tone remaining calm and professional despite the devastating nature of her words. First, you approached a situation with predetermined conclusions rather than seeking information. Second, you chose public confrontation over private inquiry. Third, you assumed authority you do not possess over personnel you do not command. Fourth, you escalated a situation based on your own ignorance rather than acknowledging the limits of your knowledge. Each point landed with the precision of a surgical strike, and Marcus felt his military career disintegrating with every sentence. The Admiral's assessment was thorough, accurate, and utterly damning. But perhaps most concerning, Admiral Mitchell continued, is the attitude that underlies these actions. Your behavior suggests that you believe your limited experience and knowledge give you the right to judge and correct others, without first understanding the situation you are entering. Marcus wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had been trying to uphold military standards, but he knew that any attempt at justification would only make his situation worse. The Admiral's analysis was too accurate and too comprehensive to argue against. Admiral Mitchell reached into her pocket and withdrew a small notebook. She wrote something quickly and tore out the page, folding it carefully before placing it on the table. Lieutenant Chen, you will report to Captain Rodriguez's office at 0800 tomorrow morning. You will present this note and prepare for a formal review of your fitness for continued service as a commissioned officer in the United States Navy. The finality of her words struck Marcus like a physical blow. A formal fitness review was essentially a court-martial in all but name, a process that would examine every aspect of his service record and determine whether he deserved to continue wearing the uniform. Marcus accepted the note with shaking hands, his voice barely above a whisper as he responded, "Yes, ma'am. I understand. Completely." Admiral Mitchell studied his face for a moment, and Marcus thought he detected something that might have been disappointment rather than anger. It was somehow worse than if she had shouted at him or shown fury at his behavior. "Lieutenant, I want you to understand something," Admiral Mitchell said, her voice softening slightly for the first time since the conversation began. "The Navy invests significant resources in developing officers. We provide training, education, and opportunities for advancement because we believe in the potential of our people to grow into leaders." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak without his voice breaking completely. "However," the Admiral continued, "leadership requires humility, wisdom, and the ability to recognize when you don't know something. It requires respect for others, regardless of their apparent rank or position. Most importantly, it requires the understanding that authority comes with responsibility, not just privilege." She gestured toward the note in Marcus's trembling hands. "Tomorrow's review will determine whether you have the capacity to learn these lessons and develop into the kind of officer the Navy needs, or whether your time in service should come to an end." Admiral Mitchell picked up her technical manual and her identification card, preparing to leave. As she gathered her materials, she addressed the entire cafeteria, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "Let this incident serve as a reminder to all personnel present. Rank, position, and authority are earned through service, dedication, and proven capability. They are not guaranteed, they are not permanent, and they must be respected at all levels of command." She turned back to Marcus one final time, her green eyes meeting his with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind, but absolutely professional. "Lieutenant Chen, I suggest you spend tonight reflecting on what kind of officer you want to be, and more importantly, what kind of leader you are capable of becoming. The Navy's investment in your development will be evaluated based not just on your past performance, but on your ability to learn from your mistakes and demonstrate genuine growth." With that, Admiral Mitchell walked toward the cafeteria exit with the confident stride of someone who had handled the situation exactly as it needed to be handled. The crowd of officers and enlisted personnel parted before her like water, each person offering respectful nods and salutes as she passed. Marcus remained standing beside his table, the folded note clutched in his sweating palm, as the weight of his actions settled over him like a lead blanket. Around him, conversations gradually resumed, but he could feel eyes watching him, measuring him, judging whether he would survive the professional catastrophe he had created for himself. The young lieutenant who had entered the cafeteria that day, filled with confidence and superiority, was gone forever. In his place stood someone who had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that true authority comes from competence, humility, and respect for others, rather than from assumptions, arrogance, and the need to demonstrate superiority. As Marcus finally gathered the courage to leave the cafeteria, he carried with him not just the note that would determine his future, but also a hard-earned understanding of what it truly meant to serve in the United States Navy. Whether that understanding had come too late to save his career remained to be seen. But the lesson Admiral Mitchell had delivered would stay with him for the rest of his life, regardless of whether that life continued in military service or in the civilian world, where consequences for poor judgment were often less immediate, but no less real.